Good morning. This is working, okay. Make sure. So, in our summer teaching, we often like to do 1 week at a time topics. So, because we're all missing 1 week or another from the class, and so I want to do kind of an intro or whirlwind tour, in a sense, of the background of the Gospel of Matthew, and I'll have the other Gospels this summer also, and then Larry will do some more teaching. And the order of the Gospels is, I'm going to take the order that they're in the New Testament, but it's very difficult for scholars to determine the order in which they were written. I've seen about 3 different theories that all were plausible. I've seen Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. I've seen Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. I've seen even Matthew, Luke, Mark in that order. That's a minority opinion, but it was actually a very persuasive argument. It's a problem called the synoptic problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the 3 synoptic Gospels. They're parallel. It's a word meaning parallel, because there's obviously a lot of similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a lot of common material. And so it's difficult to determine who wrote first and who might have used the other one and expanded upon it and so on. So we'll just take them in the order here. And hopefully this live stream goes okay. If anybody asks, we had probably our biggest technical difficulty this morning. I had to actually do something you never want to do, which is to shut everything down and do a good old Windows restart. That's the panacea for Windows, is to restart the stupid thing. Right in the middle of about the second song there, because we had no sound, and then we had no sound and no video. So, Hunter, you did a great job, and we got the 3rd and 4th songs on the on the live stream. I appreciate that. And we had fun with technology today. But hopefully this will go okay. So, Matthew. Okay. This will work. Who wrote Matthew? Well, that seems like a dumb question until you realize no gospel starts out saying this is the Gospel of Matthew or this is the Gospel of Mark. The authors did not identify themselves. Why not? Well, in those days they wrote on scrolls primarily. And after you wrote a scroll, you would write a title or a name on the outside of the scroll. And if you had a little library, it was like a bookshelf with a bunch of scrolls on it, and you look on the outside to find out which one it was. That way you didn't have to unroll the scroll and say, oh, this says Matthew at the beginning or whatever. You see it on the outside. But then when people make copies, they just, they don't consider that part of the text. The text starts at Matthew 1:1. It doesn't start on the outside of the scroll. So we have to kind of depend upon other sources, like all of the early Christians' testimony. That's called external evidence. What did people outside of the Bible say? And then there's internal evidence. Can you look inside the Bible and find evidence of who wrote it? Well, let's start with the external evidence, and what you want is for the external evidence to agree with the internal evidence. Now, in the case of Matthew, the external evidence is all very one-sided. All the early Christians referred to the first gospel as the Gospel of Matthew. No other name is ever used. There wasn't any debating about it or arguing about it. And there's not a lot of writing from Jews or Gentiles about Christian works. They weren't studying the Bible. Roman historians weren't studying the New Testament. They didn't have any opinion on anything. So basically, all the external evidence we have is this was written by Matthew. Now, What about internal evidence? Well, Matthew's occupation was what? Tax collector. Well, if we look at the internal evidence, we find signs that would be a good choice for the author, because there's a lot of special knowledge in reference to money and coins and taxes. Just looking at a count, how many times are money and coin and tax words used in the Gospels? You can see a huge discrepancy, 31 times in Matthew, 6 times in Mark, and 14 times in Luke. And those are avoiding double counting. Like in the parable of the talents in Matthew, the word talent, which is a huge sum of money, is used 14 times. If you wanted to count all of those, you could get 44 instead of 31, but the same would be true for other Gospels. So this is a good indicator of the interest. Now think about it. The apostles heard more stories than they had room to write down, right? And so one of the things that tells you about the author is what was memorable to that author. If what was memorable to him was different than what was memorable to something else, it tells you something about that author. And so one of the valuable things when you're looking at authorship is to say, what material is unique to Matthew? What material is unique to Luke? So on. And if you look at those, you can start getting clues. You know, it's a little detective hunt. Moving on from money and taxes examples. Jesus was challenged. Peter said, the temple tax collectors are here, and they're asking, do you and your disciples pay the temple tax? And eventually this resulted in a short miracle. You recall Jesus told Peter, go catch a fish. The first fish you catch will have a coin in its mouth. You can use that to pay the temple tax. But the language that was actually used is very specific here. First of all, the word for tax collector appears all over the Gospels, but this is a different word because these are the Jewish temple tax collectors, not the Roman tax collectors. And Matthew distinguishes between the two. He uses a different word here because he knows these aren't his kind of tax collector. These are Jewish temple tax collectors. But also he says, you don't always see this in English translation, but he says to Peter, go catch a fish and you'll find a stater. That's a Roman coin name in his mouth. And a stater is worth 4 drachmas, another word, and the temple tax is 2 drachmas. So a stater is worth 4 drachmas, and he says, if you'll find a stater in his mouth, and that's enough to pay your tax and mine, which adds up. And so he's showing a really detailed familiarity here with taxes and coins, and those words aren't used in any other gospel. No other gospel uses the words stater and drachma, and they don't even have that story. Now, when we look at what's unique to Matthew, a good amount of what's unique to Matthew is a set of parables that are only found in Matthew. And when you look at that list of parables, quite a few of them are about money, stewardship, and forgiveness of financial debts. There's a lot of forgiveness stories in the gospel, but Matthew seems to focus on forgiveness of debt as something that's memorable to him from Jesus' teaching. Famous parable, the workers in the vineyard. Some workers worked all day, some worked half the day, some worked only the final hour of the day. And when they found out that they were all going to be paid 1 denarius, which was a silver coin that's worth a day's wage, the ones who had worked all day weren't too happy about it, right? But the point was that the master made Can't I be generous with my own money? And this was a parable about forgiveness. You know, for one thing, we shouldn't feel like, well, I've been a Christian for this many years, and this person just converted a year before he died, and that's not fair, you know. Well, Jesus was teaching a parable. That's not how forgiveness works. Forgiveness is a generous act of grace, and God can be generous, and you don't have any place objecting to his generosity. But it's a money story, and apparently money stories caught Matthew's attention, because a lot of the parables that are only in Matthew have something to do with money, taxes, and debt forgiveness, and so on. Another one that's only found in Matthew, there was a servant who owed so many talents of silver, which was a huge sum of money. It was an obvious exaggeration. It was like, 1,000 years worth of wages or something. You could never borrow enough to owe that much. Nobody would lend you enough. They would be wise to stop at some point. But the whole point was that our forgiveness that we owe to God's grace is overwhelming. It's beyond our ability to possibly pay back ourselves. And the master forgave that huge debt to that servant. But then that servant did what? He went out to a fellow servant who owed him a small amount of money, and he wouldn't forgive him that small debt. And it was a lesson by Jesus. You'd better be willing to forgive other people, because you're being forgiven a lot more than that. And if you can't be forgiving of the small debts that others owe to you, you're not going to be forgiven of the much larger debt that you owe for eternity. Once again, though, the story's in terms of money. It's in terms of financial debt, and that catches Matthew's attention. Then there's the parable of the talents. One man's given 1 talent, huge sum of money. Another man's given 2, or another man 5, and one of them buries it in the ground, and the other 2 put it to work like they're supposed to. The word talent only appears in the Gospel of Matthew. It was a huge sum of money that maybe a Roman tax treasury would accumulate, but it wasn't the kind of sum of money that a common person would ever talk about in this time. It was an enormous amount of money. It wasn't something traded in the marketplace, So, and this gospel's the only one that uses the word talent. And then outside of parables, there are teachings, and some of them have phrases that are unique to Matthew. One of the things we see in the Gospels is that each Gospel author will either give more details in a story, or another Gospel author will condense the story to have fewer details. When Jesus sent out the disciples, Matthew records, he said, "Take no gold or silver or copper. You'll be supported by the people in the towns where you teach." But if you look at the parallel stories in Mark and Luke, they shortened it to just take no money, instead of gold, silver, and copper. So you see this mind of Matthew at work here. The money terms stick in his memory, and he doesn't just summarize them all with the word money. Only in Matthew do we find a teaching reference by Jesus to how the Pharisees would swear oaths by the gold in the temple. Another money reference that's only in Matthew. This is something that was a little bit surprising to me when preparing the lesson. We all know that Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver by the priests to betray Jesus, right? Well, I just assumed that was probably all over the Gospels. Actually, Matthew is the only Gospel that says 30 pieces of silver. The others just say they bribed him. They paid him. They don't give an exact amount. Once again, Money details seem to be what stick in Matthew's mind. What about the stories about Matthew himself? This is the only gospel that uses the phrase Matthew the tax collector. He had a Hebrew name, Levi, and that's how he's referred to in the other gospels. When a Jewish person like Matthew, or like Levi, became a Roman tax collector, he was an outcast from Jewish society, and they would give you your Greco-Roman name, in this case Matthew. And the Romans that he worked for would refer to him by that name, Matthew. And it's interesting that Matthew doesn't run away from that name. He's a repentant tax collector. But he refers to himself as Matthew. There's also the story that Larry went through a couple of weeks ago in the video from The Chosen that shows Matthew at his tax collecting booth getting called by Jesus. This is the only gospel that has that story of the calling of the Matthew the tax collector away from his job. Well, that's consistent with this being written by Matthew. He would have this story of his own calling in it because it means something to him. It's memorable to him. Right? What's the purpose of the Gospel of Matthew? What can we learn from looking through the Gospel? Well, it becomes obvious Matthew is writing a gospel that tries to reach Jews and convince them this is the Messiah that you've been waiting for. Now, why do we say that? What's distinctive in Matthew that supports that? Well, first of all, he's got a genealogy of Jesus. Why is a genealogy important? If you're a Jew and you're looking forward to the Messiah, what's the thing that you know about the Messiah's genealogy? It's got to be descended from King David, right? So that genealogy matters. And the birth story shows that he was miraculously born from the line of David, which would fit Jewish expectations even if they didn't demand it. On the other hand, what do we find, for example, in the Gospel of Mark? Is there a genealogy? Is there even a birth story? We'll see when we get on to Mark. Mark was recording the preaching of the gospel done by Peter in Rome. Now, when you're preaching to a Gentile audience, have they been steeped in Old Testament? Are they looking forward to a Messiah? Do they care about that? Do they know anything about messianic prophecy and about the Messiah needs to be descended from King David? No, so that's omitted by Peter's preaching as recorded in Mark because he's preaching to a Gentile audience, which makes the Gospel of Mark, by the way, kind of interesting as a model for us. What if we're trying to teach the gospel to people who don't really know the Bible in particular at all? You wouldn't necessarily start with Old Testament stuff like Matthew does. You wouldn't start with messianic prophecy and so on because you're starting from scratch. But if you're Matthew and if you're trying to convert the Jews a few decades after the crucifixion, you're trying to convince the Jews this is the one, this is the Messiah, then this is important stuff. Matthew is also distinctive because it has numerous references to Old Testament prophecy and typology. The difference there is that a prophecy will, for example, will say the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, David's hometown. Well, that's a futuristic prophecy. You know, it hasn't happened yet, and then at a certain point in time in the future it happens. That's what we often think of as prophecy. But Jews also engaged in typology, and when I teach maybe in the winter quarter about messianic prophecy, we'll look at that. But the Jews believed that you could see the hand of God behind the scenes of life because he dealt with his people using certain patterns that would be repeated. So, for example, the Jews noticed at one time Abram was called out of a far-off land in Mesopotamia, called to the promised land. And then the people were brought to Egypt because of famine. And then God called them out of Egypt. He rescued them from Egypt. And then they were carried off later into Babylonian exile, but he rescued them and brought them back from Babylonian exile. So Matthew will quote an Old Testament verse. For example, baby Jesus was taken by his parents where? To Egypt. And Matthew will say, this is to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets, out of Egypt I will call my son. But when you go back to the Old Testament and find that passage, it's not really a prophecy in the same way that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem is a prophecy. It's just a statement that God called his people, who are personified as his son, out of Egypt. So what Matthew is doing is he's saying, see here, the pattern continues. This is how you know that the hand of God is working all these things, because he keeps using the same pattern that he's always used in dealing with his people. It's not a futuristic prophecy that he's quoting. Sometimes it's called a secondary fulfillment, but it's really a typology. It's saying you can see the patterns of how God operates over and over. And therefore, this is a sign. This is a sign that God was operating again, just as he rescued his people from Egypt and from Babylonia. He rescued the infant Jesus out of Herod's hands and then back out of Egypt. But he also quotes many, many other prophecies that are direct prophecies. But then when you look in the Gospel of Mark begins with one prophecy about John the Baptist, that there will be a herald who comes before the Messiah. And after that, the Gospel of Mark never makes reference to the Old Testament ever again, except when Jesus does, and the Gospel of Mark is quoting Jesus from his own teaching. No more prophecy, no more typology, anything in the Gospel of Mark. Hugely different from the Gospel of Matthew, because they were for different audiences. For a Gentile audience, they know nothing about Old Testament prophecy. But for Matthew's audience of Jews, it's crucial. And so it's all over Matthew. There's also a lot of correcting of the teachings of the Jews throughout the Gospel of Matthew, because Matthew has to meet this head on. There's all the conflicts that are emphasized with the Pharisees and all of his arguments with the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. But also, and this is something that we often miss, I think, the Sermon on the Mount. If you really read closely the Sermon on the Mount, one of the phrases that Jesus keeps using is, You have heard, but I say to you, and many times when you try to look up at your cross-references in your Bible, you have heard, it's not all quotation from the Old Testament. You have heard, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy, pray for your enemy. Go the extra mile. Well, when you look at your cross-references, love your neighbor is straight out of Leviticus chapter 19, the golden rule. But hate your enemy, well, that part is not in the Old Testament. It doesn't say love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus is saying, you have heard rabbis teach you, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I'm here to correct that. Okay? Why do you suppose rabbis started teaching such a thing? They were being... They were in a circumstance where they're dominated by these unclean Romans who are taking over their land. And they have a big problem. How should we treat the Romans? Remember the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. How did that all begin? Someone asked Jesus a question. And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Luke records, seeking to justify himself, he said, well, who is my neighbor? Because Jews wanted to teach that neighbor only means your fellow Jew. The only one you have to love is your fellow Jew. You don't have to love the Romans, the Samaritans, and so on, and the Gentiles in general. And so Jesus saw what was in his mind and said, okay, let me tell you a story. And then he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And when he concludes, he says, so who acted as a neighbor to that man? And the one who was seeking to justify himself by saying, well, who is my neighbor, had to admit, well, I guess the one who took care of him was the one who acted as neighbor. But the Jews didn't want to teach that. They didn't want to teach that you actually had to love Samaritans, let alone Romans. And so Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Where did that hate your enemy come from? Well, I think it came from their circumstances. They were adding to the Scripture if they were teaching that. And throughout the Sermon on the Mount, you know, even the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are all about humility. He's countering the arrogance with which they've been taught. He's countering what they've been told. And throughout the whole Sermon on the Mount, he's saying, you have heard, even when he quotes directly from the Old Testament, he's saying, get the spirit of the law, not just the letter. Go beyond that. You have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I tell you, let's go beyond that. Let's stop lusting after some woman as an object, because that's what leads to adultery. Let's not just confine ourselves to the letter of the law. So everything in the Sermon on the Mount was really a giant correction of Jewish teachings that they had heard at the time. And if you look at what skeptical scholars or liberal scholars write, they think, why would the Gospel of Mark not have a Sermon on the Mount? I mean, the Sermon on the Mount seems so powerful. Luke has those teachings. Mark has those teachings. But once again, the Gospel of Mark recorded preaching to the Gentiles in Rome. And Peter recognized that the Sermon on the Mount was all about correcting the teachings of Jewish rabbis. And that's not what you preach to Gentile Romans. So we often don't get that from the Sermon on the Mount, but think about it. The Sermon on the Mount, to me, seems like one of the most powerful things in all the Gospels. And you go to Mark and you don't find it. But there's a reason. We're not seeing the Jewish nature of it as clearly sometimes as we ought to. This was a correction of bad teaching by the Jews, when Roman Gentiles had never heard that bad teaching. So they didn't need to hear that. So just to conclude, in an intro to a gospel, it's kind of like when you get out your study Bible and you read the intro and it says who wrote it, when did they write it, and so on. And I just want to say a word of caution about what you read in those things. If you read the intro to a gospel, it'll say, your study Bible might say, the Gospel of Matthew was, we're not sure when it was written. It might have been written in the early 60s, the mid 60s. Might have been written as late as 80, 85 AD. Why would they say that? It would be very easy when teaching a class about the Gospel of Matthew or any other gospel to just repeat that. Just say, well, some scholars think Matthew was written early to mid-60s. Some scholars say it might have been 80 to 85 AD or whatever. But before we repeat that stuff, where does it come from? Well, there's only two kinds of evidence about Gospels. There's external evidence, what people outside the Bible wrote about them, and there's internal evidence from within the New Testament. There is no external evidence that says the Gospel of Matthew was written at any particular point in time. And there's really no internal evidence either. So why would any scholar say, oh, well, maybe it was written 80 or 85 AD? Well, what's hidden from you is the assumptions they have, because some scholars, Bible scholars include conservative Christians, liberal Christians, and non-Christians who think that biblical studies is an interesting field, and they got into it. Those who are not believers in the supernatural don't believe that you can make a prophecy and years later have it come true. And the Gospels tend to record a particular prophecy of Jesus, that the temple was going to be destroyed, right? Not one stone will be left standing on another. And that happened, didn't it? It happened during the Jewish rebellion, 68 to 71 AD, against the Romans. In particular, in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple and a good bit else around it in Jerusalem. So those who don't believe in the supernatural think, this isn't really a prophecy. It must have already happened, and then somebody pretended that Jesus said this. Well, so it must be that these Gospels were all written after 70 AD. But there's really, you can search and search and search for any other basis. The only basis for people saying that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written after 70 AD is a bias, an assumption that there's no such thing as prophecy supernaturally. And since I don't agree, I need to be careful about repeating that regardless of what it says in some commentary or some study Bible. Because there is really no other basis besides assumption. There's an anti-supernatural assumption that goes into that. And there's no particular reason for us to repeat that. In fact, when we look at Luke, we'll see Luke was apparently written right before he wrote Acts. And Acts seems to terminate with Paul in Rome in the early 60s AD. So the actual internal evidence we have is that Luke, which no one thinks is the first gospel among scholars, Luke was written sometime in the early to mid-60s AD. So 2 or 3 of the first 3 gospels were almost certainly written well before AD 70. And the only reason anybody has a problem with that is because they assume there's no such thing as a prophecy like that could be fulfilled. So we'll look at Mark next week. Thank you.